Have you ever found yourself tirelessly pursuing spiritual growth, attending countless meditation retreats, reading endless spiritual texts, and engaging in various esoteric practices, only to feel that something fundamental is still blocking your progress? That sensation of hitting an invisible wall despite your most sincere efforts? I have observed this phenomenon throughout my years of studying the human psyche. There exists a profound disconnect between our conscious spiritual aspirations and the powerful unconscious forces that truly govern our being. You see, the spiritual path is not merely about ascending to higher planes of consciousness as many would have you believe. Rather, it requires a courageous descent into the darkest recesses of your unconscious mind where your true spiritual obstacles reside. The frustration you feel when your spiritual practice reaches a plateau is not a sign of failure or unworthiness. It is your unconscious mind desperately trying to communicate with you through the language of emotional and spiritual stagnation. What if I told you that the most significant revelations about spiritual transformation lie not in ancient texts or esoteric teachings, but in understanding the psychological mechanisms that have been suppressed within your own mind since childhood? The breakthrough you seek may require not more spiritual practice, but a profound psychological excavation that few spiritual teachers are equipped to guide. Through my decades of psychoanalytic exploration, I have identified specific unconscious structures that directly impede spiritual development, structures that remain deliberately unaddressed in most spiritual communities because confronting them would disrupt the comfortable narratives upon which many spiritual ideologies are built. Today, I will share with you the 5 most crucial psychological secrets that, once understood, will irreversibly transform your spiritual journey. These insights challenge conventional spiritual wisdom and may initially disturb your existing belief system, but they offer something far more valuable, a genuine path to the spiritual liberation that has thus far eluded you. I invite you to pause for a moment and ask yourself, have your spiritual practices truly led to the transformation you sought, or have they merely provided temporary relief from existential anxiety? Take notice of your immediate emotional reaction to this question, as it may reveal the very psychological resistance we will be exploring. If you feel defensive or uncomfortable, that is precisely the signal that we are approaching territory your unconscious mind has carefully guarded. This discomfort is the threshold of meaningful transformation. Let us begin our exploration with the first and perhaps most controversial secret. Spiritual bypassing is not merely an occasional pitfall but is fundamentally built into the structure of many spiritual frameworks. The unconscious mind, which I have studied extensively, is remarkably clever at creating elaborate spiritual rationalizations to avoid confronting painful psychic material. What many experience as spiritual insights are often sophisticated psychological defense mechanisms designed to protect the ego from confronting traumatic content buried within the idea. I have observed countless individuals who appear to be advancing spiritually, speaking of unity consciousness, divine love, and transcendence, while their unconscious remains fragmented and their behavior reveals unresolved childhood conflicts. This is not merely an unfortunate side effect of spiritual practice, but often its unconscious aim. The ego creates a spiritual superstructure that feels transcended precisely because it has successfully bypassed the threatening content of the unconscious. True spiritual development, in contrast, requires a methodical confrontation with your shadow material, those disowned aspects of yourself that spiritual bypassing so elegantly helps you avoid. The most telling sign of this bypassing is the spiritual practitioner who can speak at length about cosmic consciousness yet becomes irrationally triggered by mundane interpersonal conflicts. Their spiritual framework serves as a sophisticated avoidance strategy, unconsciously designed to prevent engagement with psychosexual conflicts established in their earliest development. The authentic spiritual path, therefore, begins not with transcendence but with psychological regression, a willingness to revisit and process the primal scenes and infantile conflicts that established your core psychological structure. Only by acknowledging how your spiritual aspirations may function as resistance to psychological work can you begin to integrate these fragmented aspects of your psyche. The libidinal energy that powers your spiritual seeking is the same energy I identified in my earliest research on human sexuality. The sublimation of sexual energy into spiritual pursuits is not, as many spiritual traditions claim, a transcendence of the animal nature, but rather a redirection that often leaves the original psychosexual conflicts unresolved. This unresolved material continues to influence your spiritual experiences in ways you likely cannot recognize without analytical intervention. Your peak spiritual experiences, those moments of apparent transcendence or oneness, bear remarkable structural similarities to the sexual experiences your conscious mind may be attempting to transcend. This is not to reduce spirituality to sexuality, but to recognize that the unconscious does not distinguish between these energies as clearly as our cultural and spiritual narratives suggest. The spiritual seeker who believes they have transcended their sexual nature has usually only repressed it, creating an unconscious complex that paradoxically limits their spiritual development. True integration comes not from transcending these primal energies but from bringing them into conscious relationship with your spiritual aspirations. Are you truly being heard right now? Does anyone in your life fully understand the depth of your spiritual struggle, the profound questions that keep you awake at night, the subtle experiences that have shaped your inner world? In my decades of therapeutic work, I discovered that being genuinely heard, having one's inner reality validated, is perhaps the most transformative experience a person can have. I invite you to share in the comments below one spiritual or psychological insight that has deeply resonated with you thus far. Perhaps something like, the idea that my spiritual seeking might be a defense mechanism really struck home for me. This sharing serves two vital functions. It allows you to articulate and therefore more fully integrate these insights into your conscious awareness, and it creates a community of seekers supporting each other through this challenging inner work. Remember, psychoanalysis was never meant to be a solitary journey, but one undertaken with a trusted guide. In this digital medium, we can create a form of collective analysis that, while different from traditional psychoanalysis, still offers profound opportunities for growth and insight. Now, let us continue our exploration of these hidden psychological dynamics. The second secret concerns the true nature of spiritual resistance. Throughout my clinical practice, I observed a fascinating phenomenon. The more my patients approached their core unconscious conflicts, the more they developed sophisticated resistance strategies. Similarly, the spiritual path inevitably activates powerful unconscious resistance precisely because authentic spiritual growth threatens the defensive structures the ego has carefully constructed. What manifests as spiritual plateaus, confusion, or even religious dogmatism are often sophisticated forms of resistance designed to protect the ego from profound transformation. Consider the spiritual seeker who endlessly accumulates intellectual knowledge about various traditions but never commits to a transformative practice. Or the practitioner who becomes rigidly dogmatic, using spiritual principles to reinforce rather than dismantle ego structures. These are not failures of spiritual will, but predictable psychological responses to the threat of ego dissolution that genuine spiritual transformation entails. The ego, faced with potential dissolution, creates these resistances not out of malice but as a survival mechanism. I discovered through extensive clinical observation that childhood trauma creates specific patterns of psychological defense that later manifest as spiritual resistance. For instance, a child who was punished for emotional expression may develop a spiritual practice focused exclusively on transcendence, unconsciously avoiding practices that might reconnect them with their emotional body. Another who experienced boundary violations may be drawn to absolute spiritual surrender as a way of retroactively gaining control over their original helplessness. Recognizing these resistance patterns requires brutal psychological honesty that most spiritual frameworks inadvertently discourage. The spiritual teacher who promises uninterrupted bliss or constant enlightenment is, from a psychoanalytic perspective, enabling the very resistance that prevents genuine transformation. True spiritual development proceeds not through constant expansion and positivity, but through a rhythmic alternation of insight and resistance, each resistance overcome representing an unconscious conflict resolved. This understanding transforms spiritual obstacles from sources of shame or evidence of unworthiness into valuable signals pointing toward the precise unconscious material that requires integration. The third secret involves what I call the spiritual transference. In my psychoanalytic practice, I discovered that patients inevitably project their unresolved parental conflicts onto the analyst, a phenomenon I term transference. This same mechanism operates powerfully in spiritual contexts, yet remains largely unacknowledged. Your relationship with spiritual figures, teachings, and even divine concepts is profoundly shaped by your earliest attachments and unresolved parental dynamics. The spiritual seeker who continuously searches for the perfect teacher or teaching is often unconsciously seeking the perfect parent they never had. Those drawn to punitive, judgmental spiritual frameworks are frequently reenacting relationships with overly critical caregivers, unconsciously hoping to finally earn the approval that was withheld in childhood. Even your conception of divine forces, whether experienced as loving or judgmental, accessible or distant, is shaped by these early attachment patterns. I have observed that childhood trauma creates specific distortions in spiritual perception. For example, those who experienced emotional neglect often develop spiritual frameworks where divine love must be earned through rigorous practice or moral perfection, unconsciously replicating their original attachment trauma. Those who experienced inconsistent caregiving may develop a relationship with spirituality characterized by intense devotional periods followed by disillusionment and abandonment of practice. Most troublingly, spiritual communities often unconsciously encourage these transference dynamics, creating dependent relationships that replicate childhood patterns rather than resolving them. The charismatic spiritual leader who encourages unquestioning devotion may provide temporary comfort but ultimately reinforces the very unconscious patterns that impede genuine spiritual development. True spiritual growth requires recognizing these transference patterns and gradually differentiating your authentic spiritual connection from these projected parental relationships. This process often involves a painful disillusionment with spiritual authorities and idealized teachings, a necessary psychic development that many spiritual traditions actively discourage. When you begin to recognize how your early attachment patterns shape your spiritual seeking, you gain the capacity to develop a more authentic spiritual relationship unclouded by these unconscious projections. The fourth secret concerns the developmental nature of spiritual capacity. Throughout my research, I established that human psychological development proceeds through distinct stages, each building upon the achievements of the previous stage. Spiritual development follows a similar pattern, yet many spiritual teachings present advanced states as immediately accessible regardless of psychological development. This creates profound confusion and unnecessary suffering for spiritual seekers. I have observed that specific psychological capacities must be sufficiently developed before certain spiritual realizations can be stably integrated. For instance, individuals with fragmented ego structures due to early developmental trauma often experience spiritual openings as overwhelming or even psychologically damaging because they lack the ego strength to integrate these experiences. This explains why some practitioners report psychotic-like episodes following intensive spiritual practices or plant medicine ceremonies. They have accessed spiritual states without the psychological foundation necessary to integrate them. Different forms of childhood trauma create specific developmental arrests that later manifest as spiritual limitations. A child who was not permitted to develop healthy narcissism may later struggle with spiritual teachings about selflessness, experiencing them as a recapitulation of their original narcissistic wounding rather than a transcendence of ego. One who experienced emotional abandonment may interpret spiritual detachment teachings not as liberation but as a reinforcement of their defensive emotional numbing. The spiritual path, therefore, must include not just transcendent practices but developmental work that addresses these arrested psychological capacities. This developmental perspective explains why two individuals can engage in identical spiritual practices with radically different outcomes. It is not, as some traditions suggest, merely a matter of karma or spiritual readiness, but of specific psychological capacities that either permit or prevent the integration of spiritual insights. The most effective spiritual approach recognizes your unique developmental needs and addresses these psychological foundations alongside traditional spiritual practices. This often requires periods focused primarily on psychological healing rather than spiritual transcendence, a necessity that many spiritual frameworks fail to acknowledge. When spiritual teachers pressure practitioners to manifest advanced spiritual states without addressing these developmental foundations, they inadvertently create conditions for spiritual bypassing rather than genuine transformation. The fifth and perhaps most consequential secret involves the psychodynamics of spiritual community. In my group psychology research, I discovered that groups inevitably recreate primal family dynamics, with leaders assuming parental roles and group members relating as siblings, competing for attention, approval, and resources. Spiritual communities, despite their elevated ideals, are not exempt from these unconscious group processes. In fact, the emotional intensity of spiritual contexts often amplifies these dynamics. The spiritual community that claims to have transcended ego concerns is often merely suppressing the competitive, sexual, and aggressive impulses that continue to operate unconsciously within the group. This suppression doesn't eliminate these dynamics but drives them underground, where they emerge in distorted forms: spiritual hierarchy disguised as levels of attainment, sexual misconduct rationalized through tantric philosophy, or passive aggression masked as spiritual detachment. Most troublingly, many spiritual groups unconsciously enable shared psychological defense mechanisms, collusive agreements not to challenge certain comforting illusions or to maintain specific forms of spiritual bypassing that serve the group's emotional needs. These group defenses are particularly resistant to examination precisely because they provide mutual psychological protection for all members. The spiritual seeker who fails to recognize these dynamics may spend years in communities that unconsciously recapitulate their original family trauma rather than providing the conditions for healing it. For instance, those from households with narcissistic parents may unconsciously seek spiritual teachers who demand similar forms of idealization, perpetuating rather than resolving their original trauma. The child who was parentified, forced to attend to their parents' emotional needs, often assumes a similar caretaking role in spiritual communities. True spiritual community requires bringing these unconscious group dynamics into conscious awareness, creating conditions where primal transferences can be recognized and gradually resolved rather than unconsciously enacted. This represents perhaps the greatest challenge to spiritual organizations, as it requires leadership willing to acknowledge these dynamics rather than maintaining the illusion of having transcended them. Your capacity to benefit from spiritual community depends significantly on your ability to recognize these unconscious group processes and avoid being unconsciously recruited into reenacting your original family dynamics. Now, let me introduce you to a revolutionary approach that integrates these psychoanalytic insights with spiritual development, what I call depth spirituality. This approach neither reduces spiritual experiences to psychological mechanisms nor ignores the profound psychological structures that shape your spiritual journey. Instead, it creates a dialogue between depth psychology and spiritual practice that honors both domains. The fundamental principle of depth spirituality is that psychological and spiritual development must proceed in tandem, each supporting and informing the other. This begins with a rigorous psychological inventory that identifies your specific developmental arrests, unconscious conflicts, and defense mechanisms, particularly those that manifest in your spiritual seeking. Unlike conventional spiritual approaches that often begin with universal practices, depth spirituality tailors its methods to your unique psychological structure. For some, this means focusing initially on building ego strength before engaging practices that challenge ego boundaries. For others, it means directly addressing specific traumatic experiences that have created distortions in your capacity for spiritual connection. Depth spirituality incorporates specific techniques for recognizing and working with spiritual bypassing, making conscious use of resistance rather than trying to overcome it through will, and transforming transference dynamics from unconscious reenactments into opportunities for healing. Perhaps most importantly, depth spirituality offers methods for distinguishing authentic spiritual experiences from psychological projections and defense mechanisms. A discernment that becomes possible only through a deep familiarity with your unique psychological landscape. This approach requires more initial psychological work than many spiritual seekers anticipate, but it creates a foundation for spiritual development that is both more stable and more profound than approaches that neglect these psychological dimensions. The most remarkable aspect of depth spirituality is how it transforms spiritual obstacles from sources of shame or evidence of unworthiness into valuable information about precisely which unconscious material is ready for integration. Every spiritual plateau, confusion, or resistance becomes not a failure but a signpost directing you toward your next developmental challenge. This perspective fundamentally changes your relationship to the spiritual path, replacing the common cycle of enthusiasm and disillusionment with a steady, and form progression that honors both your psychological reality and spiritual potential. After studying the human psyche for decades, I've come to recognize that the spiritual journey is perhaps the most challenging undertaking a person can embrace. Not because spiritual realization is inherently difficult, but because it requires confronting the full complexity of your psychological structure. The defensive mechanisms your psyche developed to protect you in childhood become the very obstacles to spiritual growth in adulthood. Yet these mechanisms served essential protective functions and cannot simply be discarded through spiritual world or practice. They must be respectfully and gradually transformed through a process that honors their original protective intent while creating new, more mature psychological structures that can safely contain spiritual energies. This transformation is rarely linear or comfortable. It proceeds through cycles of insight and integration, each cycle addressing deeper layers of unconscious material. The path I've outlined today differs significantly from many popular spiritual approaches. It promises not constant bliss or uninterrupted enlightenment, but something far more valuable, an authentic spiritual development that is fully integrated with your psychological reality. This integration creates a foundation for spiritual insights that are not merely temporary states but stable realizations that transform your entire being. The 5 secrets I've shared today represent just the beginning of this integrated approach. They are meant to initiate a profound reconsideration of your spiritual journey, one that honors both the depths of your unconscious mind and the heights of spiritual possibility. I recognize that this journey we've been discussing is immensely challenging. The confrontation with unconscious material that I've described is not something anyone should undertake alone. In my clinical practice, I discovered that the therapeutic relationship itself, the experience of being deeply seen and accepted, was often more healing than any specific psychoanalytic technique. The same principle applies to the spiritual psychological integration we've explored today. This channel aims to create a community of individuals committed to this depth approach to spirituality, a virtual space where these challenging insights can be shared, explored, and integrated with the support of others on a similar path. Each video I share builds upon these foundational concepts, offering specific techniques for identifying your unique psychological structures and their impact on your spiritual development. By subscribing to this channel, you join a community engaged in this revolutionary integration of depth psychology and spiritual practice. The value I offer is not spiritual platitudes or quick fixes, but a methodical approach to understanding the specific unconscious patterns that have shaped your spiritual journey. If you've resonated with these insights, please subscribe and like this video to support this work reaching others who might benefit. Remember that this journey unfolds at its own pace, a pace determined not by spiritual ambition but by the readiness of your unconscious to reveal its contents. I approach this work with complete honesty about its challenges and potentials. Unlike approaches that promise instant transformation, I acknowledge that this integration is a lifelong process with both profound difficulties and extraordinary possibilities. When you subscribe, you're not just supporting content creation but participating in a community dedicated to an authentic spiritual path that embraces rather than bypasses psychological reality. This combination of psychological depth and spiritual possibility represents the frontier of human development, a frontier we are exploring together. The personal growth you experience through this work connects directly to your capacity for authentic spiritual realization. As you integrate previously unconscious material, you create within yourself the psychological conditions that make genuine spiritual transformation possible. I invite you to join me on this journey of integration, bringing the depths of the unconscious mind into relationship with the heights of spiritual possibility.